There have been quite a few murder cases in the UK where someone has been arrested, charged and then convicted of the crime without law enforcement ever having the body of the victim. None of them have quite the interesting twists and turns that this case has today though. Welcome to Crime with Lilli. Today I'd like to have a little chat with you about a very interesting true crime case. We're going to take a deep dive into the disappearance of Malika De Fernandez, and we're going to go on quite the journey as we do. Malika De Fernandez was a woman who loved to paint portraits. She classed herself as a portrait artist, and she also loved to travel. In 1959, she met an airline executive called Peter Reyn-Bardt, and it was quite literally love at first sight. Peter was said to have got down on one knee within 2 hours of meeting Malika, and she didn't need a lot of persuading. She agreed, and less than 4 days later, Malika and Peter were married, living in rented accommodation in Manchester. Now, many people would probably say that 2 hours of knowing someone wasn't long enough to know whether or not you wanted to spend the rest of your life with them, and that proved to be the case, unfortunately, for this unhappy couple. The marriage apparently deteriorated quite badly over the coming months, and they started spending less and less time with each other. Peter stayed quite happily in a cottage in Cheshire in England, but Malika chose to spend her time travelling the world again. Because Peter was an airline employee, he got discounts which she gladly used to help reduce her travel costs. The cottage that Peter lived in was barely 300 yards from Lindow Moss, which is a bog found on the outskirts of Wilmslow. Fast forward a couple of years and Malika seemingly vanishes. As often happens in cases where one spouse disappears, her husband was immediately looked upon as suspect number one. So police interviewed Peter and thoroughly investigated his Cheshire cottage, including digging up the garden to try and find some sort of evidence of foul play. It wouldn't be easy to come by, though. If Peter had done something to Malika, there wasn't a shred of evidence left behind. We do need to remember, of course, that DNA evidence and other advanced crime-solving techniques weren't available in the early part of the 60s, which is when this crime occurred. Police had to solve murders back then in what is probably now considered to be the old-fashioned way, walking the beat, doing lots of talking to people, trying to gather evidence in a world where CCTV, DNA testing and all those other advanced investigative techniques weren't yet invented. So, for more than 20 years, Malika's disappearance went completely unsolved. She wasn't ever seen again, and Peter just gone with his life. And it was in 1983 that this case was thrown back into the limelight. Now, to understand why, we're going to have a little history lesson and a little bit of a geography lesson, I think. And we're going to have a little and a very quick look back into the history of Lindow Moss. The story of Lindow Moss starts a very long time ago, more than 11,000 years ago to be exact. Around that time, the Earth was going through a change, slowly coming out of our planet's most recent Ice Age era. During that time, the planet was heating up, the gargantuan chunks of ice that were covering it, they all started to melt. And this increased surface water, obviously, but the ice chunks themselves left hollows in their wake, and those collected water. And this is how the Lindow Moss raised mire peat bog was originally created. Now, once upon a time, Lindow Moss, also known as Saltersley Common, and I'm hoping I'm not butchering these names, covered an area of 1,500 acres or 600 hectares. And just for some comparison, the island of Gibraltar in the UK is roughly around the same size. These days, sadly, it's believed that Lindow Moss Bog only covers barely a tenth of what it did before. The bog is known for a few things, including a vast array of flora and fauna. Moss is specially preserved in the area by the Saltersley Common Preservation Society, and you'll also find green hairstreak butterflies, common cotton grass and hare's tail cotton grass in the area. It was also rife with water voles at some point, but the water levels have been decreasing pretty consistently over the last few years, and that has obviously threatened the natural habitat of the semi-aquatic rodent. Back in 1421, the first written record of the site, Lindow Moss, can be found. The Lord of Wilmslow and neighbouring Moberly agreed to let people from the area use the site to find peat, dig it up, and then sell it, use it primarily for fuel. This has been the main function of the site ever since, and peat is actually still extracted from Lindow Moss to this day. It's no longer burned for fuel these days though. Instead, mechanical diggers extract it so they can be used in compost. Mushrooms grow quite well in it, apparently. It was actually because of that peat extraction process, on May the 13th in 1983, that the disappearance of Malika De Fernandez was sort of solved, although it might not be in quite the way that you'd think. Two employees of the peat extraction industry, called Stephen Dooley and Andy Mould, were expecting peat on a conveyor belt, and they came across a large object. At first, they thought that object was a ball, maybe a football, but it soon became apparent their finding was much more ominous than that. After giving it a bit of a clean with the hands, trying to remove some of the peat, facial features started to show on the object, and they discovered that it was a head. It wasn't complete, like a complete skull, but it did still have remnants of hair, the optic nerves, eyes, brain, and other soft tissue. As you would, the two workers called the police to come and investigate, and that's exactly what they did. Experts believed that the head belonged to a female aged around 30 to 50 years of age. And that's when police recalled the disappearance of Malika De Fernandez, Peter's wife, almost 20 years before that. The skull was found close to where her husband Peter's cottage could be found, and they immediately questioned Peter, who was now 57 years of age and living in Kensington. And we get to a point where the man finally confesses to his crimes. Now, when he was questioned, he said, quote, "It has been so long, I thought I would never be found out," unquote. He had, in his view, been completely rumbled by the police. It was time for him to spill the beans. He had also not long been released from prison. Since the disappearance of his wife, Peter had moved to Portsmouth in 1963 and, according to reports, had committed a series of sex crimes against children after meeting a man called Paul Corrigan in 1975. He was reportedly sent to prison for raping, torturing and murdering a small boy during his time in Birmingham, but he was released from prison in 1981. Peter told police officers that he had killed his wife by strangulation at some point in either 1960 or 1961, 20 years before then taking an axe to her body to dismember her. After that, he took the remains, dumped them in a drainage ditch, and he allegedly confessed that he was covered in blood during the dismemberment and described it as, quote, "terrible mess," unquote. The reason for the murder was because Malika had come home to Peter's cottage and found him cohabiting, living with another man. And in his own words, this is what he supposedly said in his confession: "Malika threatened to expose my homosexuality, blackmail me and disgrace me." And we obviously need to remember that homosexuality was still very frowned upon, illegal, not good back then in society. It's not right, obviously, but that's how it was. She wanted money, so blackmailing him, she wanted Peter to give her money so that she would keep quiet about his homosexuality. But Peter didn't really have enough to give her, so they had a fight, and only one of them came out of that battle. The trial was held at Chester Crown Court in December of 1983, and Peter originally tried to have his charge reduced from murder to manslaughter. Newspapers at the time were said to have reported that he shook her to death, but didn't realise that she was dead until after he had stopped the shaking action. And originally he had tried to burn his wife to get rid of her body, but when he realised that that technique wasn't going to work, he decided to dump the already dismembered remains into the bog instead. Police found it odd that the rest of Malika's remains couldn't be found, despite officers having trawled through the bog, having looked around. And it was Detective Inspector George Abbott who decided to have a closer look at what was going on with the skull, and he decided that the partial remains that they found in the bog should be looked at a little closer. So he sent them away to Oxford University, and here they used a number of different tests, including carbon-14 dating, to date the skull, the material that they found. Now, the results actually showed that the head located in the bog wasn't the head of Malika De Fernandez at all. It couldn't have been her head, because the skull material was a lot older than that. In fact, the head could be dated as far back as to Roman Britain, around 250 AD, and that meant instead of the remains being in the bog for 20 years, they'd been in the bog for somewhere in the region of 2,000 years. And now there is some question over the exact age. Different reports give different sort of times, but experts believe that the female died at least 1,600 years before those remains were found in the bog. So absolutely, definitely could not have been Malika's remains. Once that discovery was made, Peter attempted to retract his confession. The skull didn't belong to his wife, therefore there was no remains to have to explain. Unfortunately for him, the case still went ahead. And in the end, 11 out of 12 jurors found Peter Reyn-Bardt guilty of the murder of his wife, Malika De Fernandez, and he was sentenced to life in prison on the 15th of December 1983. It took the jurors around 3 hours to come to that verdict, and the trial lasted for 3 days. The prosecutor, Martin Thomas, said, quote, "The skull had been preserved in the peat bog for over 16 centuries and obviously has nothing to do with Malika Reyn-Bardt, but the supreme irony is this. Its discovery led directly to the arrest of the defendant and to his detailed confession." Unquote. Bog bodies are actually quite a common occurrence, especially in some parts of Europe. The conditions in peat bogs, just like Lindow Moss, are actually perfect for causing human remains, animal remains, to tan rather than decompose, and that preserves them somewhat similarly to ancient Egyptian mummies. And in some cases, very, very old peat preserved bodies have been found in even better conditions than ancient Egyptian mummies. If this case has interested you, I definitely recommend doing some researching into the Lindow bog bodies. Not long after the skull featured in this case was found, about August the 1st, 1984, another human body was found, and this time it was part of a leg. It was the same actual peat industry employee as last time, Andy Mould, and he reported seeing toenails. And in total now, there are 3 segments, I guess, of human remains that have now been unearthed from the Lindow Moss bog. These have been aptly named Lindow 1, Lindow 2 and Lindow 3. Although the skull found in the Malika De Fernandez disappearance and murder was reported to have been a 30 to 50-year-old woman, experts now apparently have doubts over the gender of the skull. And with Lindow 2, that leg that was found in 1984, again by Andy Mould, archaeologists and police officers worked in the sort of same location. One of them found a flap of skin, so they worked close by and ended up finding almost complete, I guess, partial remains, I suppose, of an ancient male. And then 3 years later, in 1987, more remains were found. Now, these remains had a vestigial thumb, but was missing a head, and it is believed by some experts that Lindow 3, the headless remains, that's what they're called now, could be the full body that belonged to the Lindow 1 skull, which led to the confession of Peter. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the subject of the bog bodies of Lindow Moss today. What did you think of this story? Did you have questions? Have you got theories about it? Comments? I'd love to know what they are. Throw your thoughts in the space for comments below this video, or get in touch via my social media channels. You'll find all of my links in the description below. I can't wait to hear what you all think. Thank you so much for watching my video today. I appreciate your support so much. Please remember to subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video. I have so much more interesting stuff to come, so hit that notification bell if you want to be told first when it's coming. I can't wait to share it all with you. As always, please leave your suggestions. I'd love to create videos that you want to see, obviously. And yeah, once again, thanks so much. I hope to see you again soon.